Well, hi everyone. I'm Nadine Rogers, and I am the NIDA Certificate of Confidentiality Coordinator. I'm also a Scientific Review Officer here at NIDA. I've been in NIDA since the end of 2006, and about a year into my tenure, I began training as a Certificates of Confidentiality Evaluator, something that I've been doing 6 years. Just last year, I took over as the coordinator after the retirement of our long-term coordinator, Dr. Mark Green. Working with me is Natisha Rowe.
Hello.
I'm going to introduce Natisha and our other team member a little bit later into the presentation. I will sort of handle the first part of the presentation, and then Natisha will jump in and help you understand a little bit more about the process for applying. So we have some objectives, and I want to be certain that those objectives are met. So by the end of the session, I'd like to be clear that you understand the requirements for certificates of confidentiality. I'd like to explain to you the provisions of the certificates and have you be clear about what those coverages are, what you're getting, what the subject is getting, and maybe what you're not getting. And then I'd like you to be able to determine how to incorporate the COC application and approval process into your overall project timeline. I know that's really important to you. As I was putting this together, I thought, well, the first thing people are going to want to know, what is this certificate of confidentiality anyway? Because in many instances, as investigators, you don't encounter the need until maybe your IRB says you have to get a certificate. And so I've dealt with investigators who are very experienced, and because of the nature of the research that's conducted, they know the ins and outs of certificates. And I've also worked with investigators who didn't even know what a certificate was until the IRB said one was needed. And so what I want to share with you is that a certificate of confidentiality is a legal document. And I'm going to make this clear because it sort of drives a lot of our decision making. This is a statutory authority that's been bestowed upon the Secretary of Health and Human Services under Section 301D of the Public Health Service Act. And in that, the Secretary can authorize persons such as yourselves who are engaged in biomedical, behavioral, clinical, or other research to protect the privacy of the individuals who are the subjects of that research, and then this authority has been delegated to the NIH. So the first thing I want you to take note of is that it's intended to protect the privacy of the individuals who are study subjects. So the focus of a COC is the protection of the study subject, and we'll talk about that a little more. And so the authority has been delegated to the NIH, and so at the institute level, we can issue these certificates under the delegated authority from the Secretary of Health and Human Services. And essentially, what a certificate of confidentiality provides is it's protection against compelled disclosure. So you as an investigator, or those of you in the investigative community, cannot be compelled to disclose under the protection of a certificate. It enables you to, and others who have access to the research records, such as clinicians or other care providers, to refuse to disclose any identifying information on the research participants, whether it be in a civil, criminal, administrative, legislative, or other proceeding at all levels, federal, state, or local. And so, again, I want to be clear that this protects the privacy of the study subjects, and it doesn't really protect the data, and I'm going to show you how. So what we're talking about is the protection of personally identifiable information about research subjects in a project with the data that's stored in the USA. So U.S. law can't reach its arm across the oceans and protect data that are stored in other countries. So Certificate of Confidentiality does not cross international jurisdictions. However, many of you as investigators may be collecting data in the U.S., outside the U.S. We can protect you from forced disclosure if you store it here in the U.S. We can't protect you in Mexico or Cambodia or some of the other places where NIH research is sponsored. The protections of the certificate are for the study subjects. So really it's meant to protect the individuals from having other people find out who they are. And those protections don't extend to the data in general. So if you de-identify the data, you can share it. So if there is a requirement from a legal end, if you're subpoenaed and they want access to the data without access to personally identifiable information, then you are within the rights to release that data. The certificate won't protect you from that, but it will protect you from saying who the study subjects are. So how do these protections operationalize? How does it all work? Well, the study subject is protected from forced disclosure of identifying information. The study subject is made aware of these protections and the limits of the protections during the consent process. So the consent process is like, a sort of a contractual agreement. The investigator will tell the subject what to expect and what not to expect, and the subject has to understand that. And that's how the protections of the certificate are communicated to the individuals. However, study subjects or their family members can voluntarily disclose their own information. So the Certificate of Confidentiality doesn't protect them from sharing their own information. It protects them from you sharing their information. So the researchers are bound at the institutional level to uphold the protections that are offered. And that's why when you do an application and you send it in, we require an institutional official to sign that, because we need someone who can obligate the institution. And that's also why we don't issue certificates of confidentiality to students or fellows or postdocs who are not really employees of the institution. Now, researchers, you may voluntarily disclose under special circumstances if these special circumstances are declared upfront clearly in the consent form. So, and usually these special circumstances, we call them exclusions, apply to issues such as harm to self or others, or child or elder abuse. Because often there are laws at the state and local level that require you to disclose those issues, and we don't want those state or local things to get in the way of the protection that a COC offers. So we don't let you have language in there, and we'll talk about this some more, that might get in the way of the protections of the COC. So we don't want you to say, this works except in compliance with Minnesota law or in compliance with Georgia law. As far as we're concerned, there is no law that trumps the protections of the Certificate of Confidentiality. So you would have to declare in the consent form that you intend to voluntarily comply with laws asking for disclosure of these kinds of issues. The one thing that the certificate won't protect against is disclosure regarding the mandatory reporting of communicable diseases. And it makes sense, because otherwise the Department of Health and Human Services would be in direct opposition to laws that are put in place to protect the health of the public. And so when it comes to, if you're collecting communicable disease information, if you're doing HIV testing or TB testing or any of that, then yes, you do disclose, and that will be clearly articulated in the consent form. And then if we, the federal government, come and ask for access to the data, well, you can't use our COC to tell us we can't see the data. So that makes sense. The next question I was thinking that you might want to ask is, well, does my study need a certificate? And I spend a lot of time on the phone with people on a daily basis answering just that question. What are the things I need to consider to figure out if my study needs a certificate or not? And it always, I think, I wouldn't say always, but a lot of the times, maybe about 90% of the time, I'm speaking to an investigator who's having to view this through the institution's lens. And often it's that the IRB has asked that you get a COC, and sometimes the investigator doesn't even agree that it's necessary. But it's a stipulation of your IRB approval. And the IRB determines, well, the study subjects are going to face harmful consequences if their identity is disclosed. and because the investigator is an employee or faculty member at the institution, the IRB wants that faculty member to get coverage for the study subjects. And then the institution, via an official, is prepared to sign the assurances that obligate that the university will or the research institution will uphold the COC protection. And then I talk to researchers from a research perspective. Could disclosure be harmful to the subjects? Is there a strong likelihood that there's some other authority out there that will want access to the information? Law enforcement, the court system, or some licensing body. And could there be social, economic, psychological consequences? Are you collecting data about criminal or illegal activity, substance use and abuse, alcohol abuse? Are you collecting sensitive health information, often about mental health issues, or the fact that individuals have access, psychiatric treatment programs? Are people engaging in risky sexual behaviors? Is it a specifically vulnerable group? And this comes up a lot. I have investigators who do work, say, at the VA, and, their study subjects may be vulnerable because you're talking about a federal institution that's providing care to this population, and could they lose access if people found out certain things? Commercial sex workers. So here at NIDA, we see a lot of studies with commercial sex workers. They're engaging in behavior that's A, risky, and B, often illegal. So there's just opportunities for harm to be done. And I'll give you guys an example, and it's one of those, it's a rare example, but it's really illustrative. Very rarely, in fact, I can only think of once when I said, under these circumstances, we will not issue a certificate of confidentiality. And it was in a situation where the researchers were going to conduct analyses on data that would specifically identify pharmacists in a geographic area who were engaging in worrisome dispensing issues. So it was a study that was looking at opioid prescription diversion, etc. But the consent form didn't really say that those were the questions that were being answered, but essentially these analyses would raise this to the forefront. So the study subjects would be at risk of losing their license because the researchers intended to share their analyses with the licensing body. But then they were asking for a certificate of confidentiality. So they wanted to protect themselves from having to disclose the information, but then they were going to give the information to the licensing body. And so I said, well, there are all kinds of things wrong with this, but I'll stay out of all those things because my job is not to police your IRB, but we can't issue a certificate of confidentiality under those circumstances because there's a disconnect in the consent process. Your study subjects don't know what their risks really are. They don't know what protections they're really supposed to get from the certificate of confidentiality. They don't know where the exclusions are, and you intend to disclose their identity. So you may want to go back and work on your study protocol before coming back. So those are the kinds of things we often have to worry about. And then what we do is when we get on the phone, we often ask investigators, well, think from the subject's perspective. If someone could find out their answers, their name, their social security number, their contact information, if you're collecting genetic material, if you're doing biosamples, I once had some folks in New York call me and say, they wanted a COC. And after we were done talking, I said, well, it appears as though you're not collecting any personally identifiable data. Why do you think this is necessary? And their thing was because of where we're collecting the data. Even though we're not putting people's contact information and names and we're not collecting that, the fact is it's a known location and the people who frequent that location are well known. And so it would be easy to identify them based on the location or the answers they give us. And the sample is relatively small, so we want to still protect. So I said, okay, that's, in the interest of, of study subject identification, we went ahead with it. You may find, we have a researcher, he does work out in LA. A lot of it is looking at sort of gang behavior around drug use. And so a lot of times his study subjects won't give their name, but they've got a street name. And so that kind of thing, if disclosed, it could still put them at risk. So I tell researchers, and I'm going to tell you guys the same thing, the best possible protection that you could offer your study subjects is not to collect any identifying information. It might sound silly, but unless you're going to be doing follow-up, I mean, you have to ask yourself, do you really need this information in the first place? Because there is nothing to protect from disclosure if there's nothing. So that's one way to begin it. So sometimes in my conversations with investigators, what they walk away from the conversation and say is, you know what? We don't need to know these people's names, address, Social Security, and we don't need that information. And so I say don't collect the information that you don't need. Before we go into the process of applying for a COC, I wanted to know if anyone had any questions about what I had talked about so far. I see Leah Book has her hand raised.
Yeah, so we have encountered this with the Duke IRB and with federally funded study. We are collecting date of visit, even though we're getting rid of name, address, Social Security number. It's, what is really considered an identifier and what some people consider an identifier different. So I was just wondering to see what your opinions were, what your experience was with, having that in the consent form. What does that cover in your mind?
So, Leah, that's a good question because I've actually seen this before. And our job here is not to put you in the crosshairs between NIDA and your IRB. Our job here is a facilitating job. So if your IRB believes that date of visit is an identifier, I think it might be a little bit of a stretch because you'd have to basically go through and see every single person who had a visit on that day. But I guess what your IRB is saying, well, it's not impossible to figure it out if someone is so motivated. And in a case like that, we will give you the Certificate of Confidentiality on the basis of the fact that date of visit might be an identifier. Does that answer the question for you, Leah?
Yeah, so you would consider that, as far under the COC, you would consider that not identifiable, right?
I don't think I would consider it identifiable, but again, this is as much of an art as it is a science. If you're talking about a small clinic and there are 10 people who come in a day, then date of visit may be an identifier. But if you're talking about a huge facility that sees 300-400 people a day, then maybe date of visit is not an identifier. So I do kind of look at the circumstances as well.
Okay. Good to know. Thank you.
So how do I go about applying for a certificate? That's always, what people need to know. And I will introduce the team to you because I don't want you to think that we have this black box here at NIDA, and when you send your application, it disappears into this black box and we aren't real people. So just as you met me, so I'm the coordinator, I have a couple of folks who work with me. And you're actually going to hear from Natisha Rowe, and she is our lead Certificate of Confidentiality administrator. She's been doing this work with me a couple of years now. She receives and processes and tracks applications. She works with the investigator community on the submissions, and she interfaces with the NIDA front office because if you have received a COC, you'll see that it's signed by Dr. Volkov or a delegate of hers. And so Natisha works with that level of folks to get your COCs signed off on and back to you. and she's assisted by the newest member of our team, Chris Page. And Chris would normally be seated in the room with us, but we've deemed her sufficiently infectious that we asked her to be in another room. But Chris is a new member of the team, and she is the person who will generally respond to you. If you see a message that comes from the NIDA Certificate of Confidentiality inbox, then the chances are the person who actually communicated with you is Chris. And before I turn over and have Natisha kind of continue in our presentation, I just want to let you know that if you hear from these folks, they are really knowledgeable on the process, and they are really trying to help you. So if you hear from them, work with them to do the things that they've asked you to do and to get the documentation they've asked you to get, because their goal is to get your package completed and evaluated and off up the stairs. And, you know, if you don't give them what they ask for, I can't sign off. So I just want you guys to know who we are and how we work together. And the next voice you're going to hear is Natisha as she talks about what you need to obtain a certificate.
Hello. I'm going to start with what is needed to obtain a COC. When applying for a COC, you need to ensure that you have a study that is within the scope of the NIH mission, even if that study is not NIH funded. You will also need a current IRB approval or an official notice that the approval is waiting on insurance of a COC. You will also need an IRB-approved consent or assent form that clearly describes the protections and limitations of the COC. You will also need an application letter, which should include the insurances signed by the PI and institutional officials.
So Natisha, quick question for you. You mentioned an IRB-approved consent or assent form that clearly describes the protections and limitations of the COC. So have you seen forms that either don't talk about the COC or they don't speak about it in language that their audience would be able to understand?
Yes, that is something that we come across quite frequently. Most of the time, the consent forms are submitted and they do not have the COC language, or they do not mention the COC or the
or the exclusions, the protections that I spoke about earlier. Yes.
The COC, yes. If we do find that, then your consent form cannot. Without that, we cannot approve your application. We cannot process the application. So we need to have the consent form with the correct language.
Okay.
When submitting the application, this is a manual process. You will need to answer all 14 questions, even if the answer is not applicable. The study description must be clear and succinct, and it must convey the scientific purpose of the study and exactly what is being done, to whom, in what way, and why. The COC is not being written for a scientific audience, so it is important for us, and it makes it easier for us if the purpose is clear and succinct. The assurances must be signed by an authorized institutional official, and if there are controlled drugs that are a part of the study, we will need a copy of the DEA and state licenses. If the study is of an investigational new drug, the application will go to Sherry George, who is a part of the FDA. NIH has no authority to issue COCs on INDs.
So, Natisha, I wanted to ask you a question about two things. One is, what happens when the language that comes in the application isn't clear, when we're not clear about what the study is actually doing? Because I'm scientifically trained and you're not, and sometimes between us we still can't figure it out. Tell me a little bit about what happens in a case like that.
If the study description is not clear, it actually adds on extra time for me to kind of find out what is what the study is about. I have to look through the consent form sometimes or the assent form to figure out what the description is.
I think also what happens is we're not sure that we're putting the right language in there for the legal protections that the COC offers if we have to spend a lot of time figuring out what's happening with the study. So I think essentially what you're saying is that not to send us copies of the whole protocol and all of that, but just to really take the time to write a paragraph about the study that a lawyer could understand.
Exactly.
The other question that I had for you was about the investigation on new drugs, because sometimes we get those applications.
Yes.
What do we do with those?
When we do get an application that has an investigation of new drug, it goes to Sherry George. I automatically just forward her whatever application materials were sent to me, and I will send an email to the PI letting them know that it's been forwarded to the FDA. And it's out of my hands once that is done.
Okay. So it won't fall into a black hole,
no.
But I think that it takes much longer if you send it to us and then we have to contact the FDA.
Yes.
It just adds time, right?
It does add time.
Okay. All right. Where can folks find the directions on how to apply?
The application instructions can be found, if you look on the slide, there's a link below. It's grants.nih.gov/grants/policy/APPL_extramural.htm. And there's also a link for this NIH COC kiosk.
So someone asked the question, I can sort of see it on my screen, about whether each institute has their own contact people.
All the people that you would need to contact in different offices and institutes is on the kiosk. In trying to figure out the project timeline, as some of you may know, the COC process can take up to 12 weeks. And this process depends on the PI and what you submit when you are submitting your documents. We do not process COC applications without the IRB approval, unsigned letters, consent forms that do not address the COC, and out-of-date IRB approvals. The main issue that I have when processing COCs is the consent form language. I come across this pretty much every day. Most of the consent forms do not mention the COC, or they do not mention the exclusions to the COC, so we have to let the PIs know, your consent form has some language issues, and most of the time they have to resubmit to their IRB, which can prolong the process, and it can take longer than 12 weeks to get the signed COC. And this is something that, is out of my hands once I do come across this issue.
So Natisha, I see that you're saying, so we need the IRB approval, and then we take about 12 weeks. What about in those instances where the IRB won't give approval unless they get the COC? Investigators are sort of stuck between a rock and a hard place. What do we do about that?
If the IRB will not grant approval without the COC, then a conditional approval is needed, which needs to explain that the COC is the last step in gaining the IRB approval.
Okay, so we will work with a letter that says, once you grant the COC, we will grant IRB approval.
Yes.
But if there are other reasons why the investigator can't get IRB approval, then we won't do a COC for that, will we?
No, we don't.
Okay. So I want to say something, because I've got this little cartoon here that says, oh my, I have 2 weeks before we go into the field and I need a COC. Let me call Dr. Rogers. I get a lot of those calls. And I am totally empathetic, but NIDA has one of the highest loads of COC processing. We do about 200 of these a year, and we process them in order that they were received. And so if you call and say, I need to go into the field in 2 weeks and I need my COC, just think of all the other investigators who've already applied and who are waiting for theirs. And if we suddenly drop theirs and work on yours, I mean, that would just create a lot of chaos. And so when you're doing your timeline, it would be important to look at your calendar, map out how long it takes for your IRB approval, which on our end, we just don't have any idea what the rhythm of your IRB might be at your specific institution. But you've got a calendar, and you sort of map that out, and then you say, okay, we submit to NIDA, and we've got to leave 12 weeks for that. And we often don't take the whole 12 weeks, but we might need it. And if we have to keep recontacting you, that's just adding time to the clock, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, so this is a biggie for folks in the field. I know this. So we wanted to just recap a couple of things before we open up for questions. One of the big things I like to convey is that the intent of a Certificate of Confidentiality is to protect the study subjects from unwanted disclosure. It's not a wall that the investigative community can hide behind. It's a legal document to protect study subjects from unwanted disclosure. If they want the disclosure, that's on them, but it's what they don't want that we're here to protect from. The consent process is really important because this is your transaction between your study subjects and the investigative team. This is where you want to tell study subjects of the COC, the coverages it offers, and its limitations. And its limitations include those instances when you're going to either voluntarily comply with laws or regulations asking you to disclose for reasons such as self-harm or harm to others or any of those reasons. But also, if you are doing communicable disease testing, you need to clearly explain that a COC doesn't offer protection against the disclosure of positive test results. And then I would say the best protection is not to collect identifying data at all.
And when processing applications, we need to have the IRB approval. We cannot issue any COCs without the IRB approval. The process can take up to 12 weeks, and to minimize additional delays, please be sure that the application is complete before submitting to NIDA.
So we can take questions, and I'm going to let Tracy, our chairperson, manage that, but I do have one quick question that popped up on the screen here for me, and I'll answer that now because I think it speaks to things we've just this second covered. So I get the question all the time, can we apply for our COC application and our IRB approval at the same time to save time on the clock? The answer is no, you can't do that because we actually need your IRB approval in order to go forward with the COC application. So you have to do one and then the other. Tracy, there are two hands raised I can see.
Okay, great. So we'll start out with Matt, but Matt, give me a second to unmute the lines, and then you can go ahead. One moment.
Hi. So within the CTN, we often run into situations where sites are required to obtain approvals from multiple IRBs. Many of them are, the studies are conducted through nodes, and those nodes have their own IRBs. And then the community treatment programs or other academic institutions, the actual sites themselves, may have their own IRBs. So what are your requirements in that type of situation where multiple IRBs are involved?
Mercifully, Matt, our intention is not to drive everyone nuts with the whole sort of multiple IRB thing. So what we require is documentation from the lead site IRB. So what we require is that the lead site keep track of the approvals received from the other sites. And quite often, the lead site has that information, and it's included in the application, and we keep it on file. But we don't require all of the sites to be synced up in order for the COC application to go forward. We only need the lead site to have IRB approval and present consent forms, et cetera, and we provide the COC to the lead site with the expectation that you're going to manage the other sites in line with the coverages offered by the COC.
And that would be the same, that would be true as well if there were a central IRB that was used?
Yes, that would be true.
Great. Matt, does that sufficiently answer your question?
It does. Thank you.
Hi, this is Christine. I have a question, and it's probably a lot of people already know this, but for the COCs, is this, do most people apply for them after they have been notified that their application is going to be funded, or do they submit for a COC when their application is due for to be received by NIDA for council review?
So Christine, in response to a really good question, funding is not a requirement for, NIH funding is not a requirement for receiving a COC. So those two things are delinked. Often when we get applications, investigators have already received their funding, and so the funding source is declared in the COC. But sometimes the funding has not been received yet, and so we will say Dr. So-and-so is responsible for the conduct of this study, or the funding will come from a source other than NIH, and we will declare that funding source as well. So, Christine, the short answer is no. You don't need to have your funding, but you do need to have your IRB approval.
And then we have Eve Gelstrom, who has a question.
Hi, Dr. Rogers. Thanks so much for doing this for us and helping us all get a better handle on COCs and applications and how to go through doing this. I wanted to ask a question that was related to the one that Matt asked earlier. As you know, in the CTN we have typically a lead node or a lead team that has the PI with the study, and they're the ones who are then bringing on maybe 2 to 3 to 7 to 10 other sites. So what I understood from what you were saying earlier, they can submit their COC application when the lead node has gotten their approval from their IRB to you all. Now as they add sites to the study, each site may have its own individual IRB and its own individual informed consent. Do each of those sites then need to do their own individual COC application with you, or can they piggyback onto the lead node COC that's already in place? Because what I'm hearing sounded a little different from what I understood previously.
So Eve, what you've asked is actually a very nuanced question. It seems simple, but it's actually not. So if you are doing a multi-site study, which connotes that either all the sites are using the same protocol or the same study subjects, or for example, you've got one node that's doing enrollment and analyses are being done somewhere else, and that's really one study, even though it's got multiple locations, multiple sites have different roles to play. So in a case like that, where that is truly a multi-site study, then only the lead site need apply. And sometimes investigators, for the sake of tidiness, do update us and say, we've added these sites, or they want an amendment to their COC to include some new sites that they've added, and they'll send me the documentation. And if I notice that the consent forms are not in alignment with the lead site, I'll push back and let the lead site know about that. But the lead site is expected to sort of manage all of that in the case of a true multi-site study. Now, if it's not really a multi-site study, just because the nodes may be connected to each other for different reasons, then those are separate studies. So I actually had one, I think it was last week, that came in and that had this very question. And after I had considerable conversation with the investigator, it became clear that that there would be separate study subjects, because even though the study subjects were in some way related to the originally enrolled subjects, they were not the same as the originally enrolled subjects. We figured out that while it was sort of funded as a sub-study, etc., in fact, it was a separate protocol that they were going to be employing. And so after some consideration, I said, I think you need to apply for a separate COC. So as I said earlier, this is more art than it is science. It's not always an exact thing. You've got to figure out sometimes what's going on between the lines. Does that help, Eve?
Yeah, so let's say University of Miami is the node where the study is. They may have related sites who are under the same protocol, but they're under different IRBs, and they may be in New England and maybe in Ohio and maybe in California, and may have sites, kind of all across the country. Each of those does not need to submit for a COC application because they're all under the same protocol doing the same study.
Yes.
And they can therefore then be under the umbrella, in essence, of the parent.
Absolutely. So you've called it right. If it's a true multi-site study and you've got a parent site and the rest are sort of, to carry the metaphor, the children, then that does not require separate COCs for every site.
Okay. And we can, as they add sites or in some cases get rid of sites for whatever reasons, they would just send you a letter saying we're adding these 4 sites with whatever information. Do they have to wait for anything back from you for those sites to then be doing their research, or it's just an information for you to add to your file on that study?
If you request an amendment, because sometimes the adding or dropping of sites includes other changes. It may also include changes to personnel, or it may include tweaks to the original protocol. And so in those cases, it's helpful to request an amendment, which we will issue, forthwith. And then your whole study will continue to have that coverage integrity. But, I know sometimes it might seem like, that's just kind of a headache. Why do we want to bother applying? They'll just add time. But then if you've got a breach in your protection wall, do you really want that for the sake of saving a couple weeks? So if it's just a simple, we're adding these 2 sites and we're removing these 2 sites, that's one thing. But if the sites are named in the COC and you're going to make changes to those, you want to get an amendment.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And that amendment, is that the 90 days as well, or no?
I will tell you the truth. Often amendments don't take that long. It just really depends on how much else is in the pipeline before you send yours in. If it's at a time when the pipeline is light, then we could turn it around very, very quickly.
If, let's say, this lead node has their university IRB, and let's say they have a city IRB they have to go to, and both of them are considering themselves IRBs of record, meaning they both want to see everything for this study, in the application to you, you would want to have an application maybe in essence from both of those IRBs, and both of those IRBs would need prisoner representatives sitting at the time of the review.
This is actually a really good question, Eve. I can't remember the last time I saw one of these, but it's quite odd that I would remember the city. I think it was Philadelphia, actually, where there was requirement for a city-level IRB. And for my purposes, yes, I would need both, because if you're going to have 2 IRBs of record, then I wouldn't want to be the person picking and choosing which IRB approval we give weight to. If you're in a circumstance that requires 2 IRB approvals, then that's driven by the circumstance and not by our rules and regulations. And so I would wait for the 2 IRB approvals before submitting. And in your application letter, I would explain that 2 IRBs of record are required.
Wonderful. Thank you for clarifying that for us.
See here. Christy Thomas. Hi, Christy. Please start.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Tracy. This question is in relation to the question that Eve, her first question about COC amendments. And so I've had some experience in the past where we've submitted an amendment thinking that a change would require such a submission to NIH and received feedback that this is an administrative change, an amendment is not required. So I just wonder if you can clarify further about the circumstances in which would dictate full-on submission and therefore amendment versus its administration, we don't even need to send it in. And I think in that case, if I recall correctly, it was more site changes as opposed to substance of the protocol or any of the procedures that might require protection.
So if you remember, Christy, I said a little earlier to Eve that sometimes changes to sites or things that seem so simple may have effect on other things. And so, first of all, I want everybody on the call to know that there's just no harm in picking up the phone and calling me and asking me a question, because I'm not going to make you waste time putting an application together if you don't need it. So your first line of defense is you can call and ask me the question. But the second thing is, if you're just changing out a site, so for example, especially if the COC doesn't name your specific clinic sites. You know, if the COC doesn't name that you're doing it in partnership with Treatment for America, I'm just making a name up, and you change from Treatment to America to Treatment for Illinois, we don't need to see that because it doesn't make any changes to the coverage of your COC. But however, if you have a co-investigator who's named as key personnel on the study at Treatment for America, and now you're not going to engage with that PI anymore, and you're going to have another PI, then we would want to know that because we'll want to make that change. Do you see what I'm saying? So some things are merely sort of paperwork, and we're not going to put you through the changes associated with applying for an amendment. But some things, if you're going to make tweaks to the protocol and things like that, then yes, it is an amendment.
Great. Thank you, Nadine, for the help.
I hope that was helpful, and like I said, I'm always available to call, for you to call and ask the question.
Yeah, absolutely. That was really helpful, and it just the recollection is a little vague. It's probably for an earlier study. I know typically when we get our COCs, it's usually named only the lead site. So, for example, I'm at UCLA and it'll say UCLA will say our UCLA investigator, although in the application itself, we've notified you of all of the various participating sites. So where the COC document doesn't name all those others, the application did, and so in some ways you wonder, well, now that those sites are different, should we let you know? And that's what we just erred on the side of caution and submitted it, and then got feedback back saying you don't need to submit this. So the clarification here helps. It just sounds like just pick up the phone and call you first.
Absolutely. And the other thing is, we won't give you feedback here at NIDA that you don't need to give it to us. We'll put it in the file. Now, what feedback you might get is that this doesn't necessitate us issuing an amendment. You're covered.
Yes, that was it. Oh, yes, that was it.
And that puts your mind at ease.
Yes. Thank you so much.
No worries.
Leah Book, is the COC required or is it an option for eligible studies?
So, it's an option for eligible studies if you have a concern for the well-being of your study subjects. So, remember earlier I showed a slide that talked about, thinking about it from the researcher's perspective, and then I showed a slide thinking about it from the study subject's perspective. So let's give an example, particularly since at NIDA, a lot of our study subjects are engaged in high-risk, illegal, and sometimes truly criminal behavior. If you want to go into the prison system and you want people to openly engage with you in answering the questions that you have and being full partners in forwarding your research questions, then would you really want to not offer them the protection because they're in prison and prison officials could subpoena you or get access to and find out all manner of things about people who are already vulnerable. Would you, as a researcher in good conscience, want to engage people in that research without offering them those protections? So it's not a question about the mandatory nature of a COC. It's more a question about the ethical nature of collecting certain information from people that puts them at risk and not taking the steps to provide them with the protections that are available. And often the IRB will answer that question. It won't be a case of is it mandatory or not. The IRB will answer that question for you in a lot of times.
Christy, is that you again?
Sorry, yes. I just figured while we're all here, may as well get it out. So can you talk about expiration dates? So, for example, typically at the start of the trial, we'll get, let's say, we'll let you know the length of the project, and maybe the certificate will be issued for 3 years. We find that recruitment hasn't gone as quick as expected, and so there's a need for an extension. Can you talk about extension, but also about the protections that are in place for the individuals even beyond the life of the expiration date? For example, we protect their privacy forever, not just for the 5 years that the certificate is approved.
Absolutely. So I want to be clear. That's a great question, Christy, and I really appreciate that you put it out there. So here are a couple of things. Once we issue a certificate of confidentiality, you are expected to protect your study subjects in perpetuity. Now, a lot of times that issue goes away because a lot of times you say within 5 or 7 years you destroy all personally identifiable information anyway. So a lot of time it's a problem that takes care of itself. However, the reason that there's an expiration date on the certificate is not because that's when your obligation to protect the study subject ends. It's when our understanding is that that's when your study is no longer active. And so in general, if you put in a request and you say, we're going to need this until 2017, we actually, if you notice, will give you an extra year. Because we're sensitive to the fact that things may not go well, recruitment may be slow, different things may happen, and you may actually not get done in 2017 and you actually need the extra year. We also get people applying for extensions because they've gotten a no-cost extension on their funding, and that's given them an additional sort of bridge year, and they want to be sure that they're protected because the study is still active, and we'll do that. There's also another thing that happens. How long it takes to apply. So when you're getting ready to expire and you realize that, oh my, we've got more funding. We're going to keep this going. We're going to go for another 5 years, but our certificate expired and we're still live. What do we do? So here's a little heads up I'm going to give you guys. Natisha and Chris and I, we are really nice people. And so even if you let your certificate expire and you call us, while you're pulling your hair out, we'll make it happen. And we will date the certificate so the certificate provides continuous coverage while the study is alive. But the other thing that I think that you guys also need to be aware of is that the rules say that after 90 days we shouldn't be renewing a certificate, for a date expiration. So technically, 90 days from when your certificate is due to expire, you should apply for the extension. Now, as I said, we kind of make it happen while things are manual. But there is a movement to do the whole COC process NIH-wide through an electronic database system. And that system will, in fact, issue you a reminder that you're going to have an expiration, and then the 90-day rule is going to be in effect. And I'm not sure whether or not we'll have the ability to work around it because now it's not a manual system, it's digital. So just bear in mind, look at the expiration date when you receive your certificate and sort of have your project directors, note that date and backdate it 90 days if you think your study is going to still be alive.
Nadine, is there any timeline on when the automated system will become effective?
You know, Tracy, no.
Okay, that's okay. At least we have a heads up. So I knew some of my, CTNers out there would be asking the question, so I thought I'd just put it out there. But I can keep in touch with you as well and check in from time to time to see when that'll happen.
Okay, good. Good.
Sounds great. Well, I'd like to thank you both, Dr. Rogers and Natisha Rowe, for sharing your expertise with us. Our studies definitely have a vulnerable population, so we want to ensure that all of our study staff are aware of application process and what it covers for Certificates of Confidentiality. So thank you for coming, and we look forward to working with you in the future.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Absolutely. So next month, we're going to have the human research protections about prisoners, and Julia Gorey will share that information with us. So please join us Wednesday, October 1st. We will send out invitations as we did with this presentation. And we're not going to leave you hanging. We really want you to have this information available, so we're going to post it in the next 2 weeks to the CTN Dissemination Library. So I want to thank everyone for attending, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you.
Thank you. That will end our presentation.